Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku was the mutant Omega level threat in X-Men history. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The coffee in Scott Summers' mug had gone cold. He hadn't noticed. No one in the briefing room had touched their morning beverages. The air, usually filled with the low hum of Cerebro's standby systems and the scent of beast chalk dust, was taut with a tension that felt ancient and electric. On the central holographic display, a three-dimensional map of the Eastern Hemisphere rotated slowly. Most of it was a placid blue-green, dotted with the familiar signatures of known mutants and the low-level chatter of human civilization. But one spot, a festering wound on the coast of Japan, pulsed with a malevolent crimson. It wasn't a flare-up. It was a hemorrhage. It began 37 minutes ago, Dr. Hank McCoy stated, his deep, rumbling voice at odds with the delicate way he manipulated the hollow controls with his large, blue-furred fingers. A single, sustained energy spike originating from the geometric center of the Muzidafu quarantine zone. The readings are inconsistent with anything I have ever recorded. Wolverine, leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed over his chest, let out a low growl. Inconsistent how, Hank? Spill it. My sinuses feel like they're full of pop rocks and I want to know why. The energy itself registers as purely kinetic. Beast elaborated, adjusting his spectacles. No thermal radiation, no electromagnetic pulse, no exotic particles. Just raw, potential motion being held in a state of impossible stasis. The sheer scale of it. Logan's analogy, while crude, is not inaccurate. It is a powder keg the size of a city block, and something has just lit a very, very long fuse. Scott stared at the pulsing red light. Muzidafu. No one's been in or out of there in over a decade. The Japanese government has it under a permanent Level 7 biohazard and tectonic instability charter. It's a ghost town. A tomb, more accurately. Aurora Monroe said, her voice a soft and somber whisper. She stood by the armored window, gazing out at the serene grounds of the Jean Grey School, but her mind was clearly thousands of miles away. I remember the day it happened. The atmospheric pressure over the entire Kanto region dropped instantaneously. No storm, no front. The air itself was simply thinner. As if the sky was holding its breath. I remember the psychic scream, Jean Grey added, her eyes closed. She rubbed her temples, a faint, ruby glow flickering around her fingertips. Even now, a decade later, the memory was a scar on the collective unconscious. It wasn't one voice. It was thousands, all extinguished in the same microsecond. But beneath it all, there was something else. A single point of terror and confusion so profound it was like a black hole in the astral plane. Scott turned from the map to face his team. Cyclops, the field leader, took over from the concerned man. His voice was crisp, authoritative. For the students who weren't born yet, give us the official history, Hank. Why is Muzidafu a forbidden city? Beast dimmed the lights and swiped a hand across the console. The map was replaced by grainy, archival news footage. A panicked reporter, her face smudged with dust, was shouting into a microphone over the wail of distant sirens. The date stamp in the corner read 10 years ago. The event is officially known as the Muzidafu catastrophe. Hank narrated, his tone taking on the detached quality of a lecturer. Initially, it was believed to be a localized, high-yield earthquake, or a new type of villain attack. The truth, as uncovered by Professor Xavier and a handful of other sources, was far more disturbing. The footage shifted to a shaky aerial view from a helicopter. The destruction was breathtaking in its uniformity. An entire district of the city was flattened, not blown apart, but crushed. Skyscrapers were pancaked into layers of concrete and steel no taller than a 2-story house. Roads were buckled, but not cracked. There were no fires. No radiation. No blast crater. It was as if a colossal, invisible god had simply pressed its thumb down on the city. Analysis concluded that this was the manifestation of a single, previously undocumented X gene. Hank continued. An Omega-level mutant with absolute dominion over kinetic energy. The running theory is that the mutant, a child based on preliminary reports, lost control. They didn't emit an explosion. They did the opposite. They began to absorb. He brought up a simulation on the display. A single point of light appeared in the center of a grid-like city. Lines of energy, representing kinetic force, began to flow towards it. They absorbed the momentum of a moving truck. Then the vibrations of the ground. The sound waves from the ensuing panic. The motion of the wind. The seismic energy in the tectonic plate beneath the city. The potential energy in every structure. Every heartbeat. Every breath. It all flowed into one single point, a human singularity, Wolverine grunted. And then it went boom. No, Jean corrected softly, her eyes still closed. That's the most terrifying part. It didn't go boom. An explosion pushes outward. This pulled in. The release was a compressive wave, a silent, instantaneous cancellation of all structural integrity. Everything was simply broken. The mutant was designated Deku by the Japanese government, Beast added, bringing up a heavily redacted file. A single, blurry school photo of a small, freckled boy with a shock of untamable green hair was visible for a moment before being covered by a large, red deceased stamp. Izuku Midoriya, diagnosed as quirkless, a baseline human, at age 4. His X gene must have been deeply recessed. He was presumed to have been vaporized at the epicenter of his own uncontrolled manifestation. Since then, his name has become a cautionary tale in the global mutant community. A boogeyman. Control yourself, or you'll become a Deku. A ghost story? Scott's jaw was tight. And now the ghost is rattling its chains. He looked at the live feed again. What could cause a dormant energy signature of this magnitude to flare up after a decade of silence? People, Logan growled, finally pushing himself off the wall. He stalked towards the hologram, his shadow falling across the map of Japan. I'm smelling saltpeter and self-righteousness all the way from here. Someone's poking the bear. As if on cue, another alert flashed on the screen. It was an encrypted intercept from Forge. Logan is correct, Beast announced, his brow furrowed. We have chatter from a known cell of purifiers. They're boasting about breaching the Muzidafu perimeter. Their communications are filled with rhetoric about harnessing God's judgment, and claiming the weapon that smote the mutant city. Scott's fist clenched. The purifiers. Fanatics who saw mutants as a demonic plague, to be cleansed with fire and faith. They think the energy source is a weapon they can control. Jean realized with a dawning horror. They have no idea what they're dealing with. They are zealots standing on top of a live volcano, arguing about who gets to hold the bucket. Ororo said, her eyes flashing with the barest hint of lightning. Then we have our mission, Scott declared, his voice leaving no room for argument. Gear up. We're going to Japan. Phase 1, neutralize the purifiers and secure the zone. We cannot let them provoke this thing, whatever it is. Phase 2, identify the source of the energy signature. Assess and, if necessary, contain it. And if containment ain't an option, bub? Logan asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. Scott's gaze was hard as diamond. Then we make sure the ghost of Muzidafu stays a ghost. The blackbird cut through the stratosphere like a scalpel, its stealth systems rendering it invisible to the world below. The journey was silent, each member of the team lost in their own preparations. Logan meditated, his breathing low and even, but his senses were a raw, open nerve, already tasting the strange, dead air of their destination. Ororo communed with the jet stream, guiding their path through the upper atmosphere, her expression serene but her mind troubled by the unnatural stillness she felt radiating from the Japanese coast. Jean and Scott sat side by side, a silent conversation passing between them, a mixture of tactical planning and shared concern. Their descent was a slow, spiraling glide into the heart of the quarantine zone. As they passed through the cloud layer, the city of Muzidafu revealed itself. It was worse than the archival footage. Nature had tried to reclaim its stolen territory with a savage, desperate vigor. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, crawled over the skeletons of buildings, its green leaves a jarring splash of life in a monochrome landscape of gray concrete and rusted steel. Entire roads had been swallowed by resilient bamboo groves. A profound, unnatural silence hung over everything. There were no birds. No insects. No rats scurrying in the rubble. It was a city-sized vacuum. The air is heavy, Aurora murmured, her hand pressed against the cockpit's canopy. The pressure is stable, but stagnant. Motionless. It feels wrong. I'm not getting any psychic traces of the purifiers, Jean reported, concentrating. But the residue here. Scott, it's overwhelming. It's like a photograph of a screen, burned into the very fabric of the place. Scott landed the Blackbird with practiced ease in the cracked remains of a public square, the jet's vertical thrusters kicking up decade-old dust that settled almost immediately, as if reluctant to remain airborne. The ramp lowered with a hydraulic hiss that sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. The X-Men disembarked, their colorful uniforms a stark contrast to the bleak surroundings. The air didn't just feel still, it felt thick, like wading through water. Every step seemed to require a conscious effort. There, Cyclops commanded, pointing towards a collapsed overpass. Energy signatures. Low-tech. Ballistic weapons and portable power sources. That's them. The confrontation was brutally efficient. The purifiers, a dozen of them in white tactical gear emblazoned with their stark cross insignia, were attempting to drill through a wall of debris with a heavy-duty plasma cutter. They were so focused on their task they didn't notice the X-Men until it was too late. For the grace of God! It's the freaks! One of them yelled, raising his rifle. Before he could fire, a concentrated bolt of optic energy blasted the weapon from his hands. A localized fog rolled in from nowhere, courtesy of Storm, sowing confusion and chaos. Wolverine was a blur of motion in the mist, the snick of his claws followed by the clatter of dropped rifles and pained grunts. Jean Grey simply raised a hand, and the remaining purifiers were lifted into the air, their weapons wrenching themselves from their grasp and assembling into a neat pile on the ground. The fight was over in less than 30 seconds. They're fanatics, not soldiers, Scott noted as he bound the last one with a set of restraints. What were you trying to accomplish here? He demanded of the cell's leader. The man spat at Scott's feet. We came to claim the divine weapon. The righteous fire that cleansed this mutant Sodom. Its power will be our salvation. The only thing you've found is a trip to a Japanese prison, Scott said, turning away in disgust. He looked at Beast, who was tinkering with a handheld scanner. Hank? Where is the real source? Beast's eyes were wide behind his glasses. Scott, the readings the purifiers were following are just echoes. Residual energy clinging to the debris. The true epicenter is that way. He pointed deeper into the flattened district, towards the skeletal remains of a residential high-rise. And it's not a dormant signature anymore. It's active. It's observing us. A cold dread trickled down Scott's spine. He looked at his team. Jean, Logan, Aurora, with me. Hank, stay with the jet and get the authorities on the line. Let them know we have some garbage for them to pick up. The 4 X-Men moved deeper into the dead city. The feeling of thickness in the air grew stronger with every step, a physical pressure against their skin. The silence became deeper, more absolute. Even the sound of their own footsteps seemed muffled, absorbed by the world around them. Wolverine suddenly stopped, his head cocked. You feel that? He growled. The pressure is increasing. Aurora confirmed. No. Not that. Logan's eyes were narrowed. It's the lack of feeling. The ground beneath my feet, there's no vibration. None. It's like we're walking on glass. They were getting closer. The ruins here were more compressed, the destruction more total. They approached the husk of the apartment building Beast had indicated. It was a concrete shell, its floors pancaked one on top of the other, leaving a hollowed-out atrium in the center, open to the gray sky. And in the middle of that atrium, there was a shimmer in the air. A distortion, like a heat haze on a summer road, but it gave off no heat. It was a sphere of influence perhaps 20 feet in diameter. Inside that sphere, time and motion seemed to be broken. A piece of rebar, shaken loose from the ceiling by their approach, fell. But it didn't hit the ground. It simply stopped, a foot above the floor, hanging in midair as if frozen in a snapshot. A cloud of dust kicked up by Wolverine's boot drifted to the edge of the shimmer and ceased its movement, its particles suspended in perfect stillness. Jean gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. It's a null kinetic field. A perfect one. Nothing moves in there unless he allows it to. He? Scott asked, his hand instinctively going to his visor. And then he saw him. At the very center of the sphere of stillness, sitting on a pile of rubble with his knees drawn to his chest, was a young man. He couldn't have been more than 18 or 19. He was painfully thin, his frame swallowed by a ragged t-shirt and torn jeans. His face was sharp with malnutrition, decorated with a constellation of freckles that stood out against his pale skin. His hair was a wild, untamed mess of dark green, and his eyes, wide and luminous, were the same startling shade. Those eyes were fixed on them, and they held a terror so deep and ancient it seemed impossible for someone so young to contain. This was not a ghost. This was not a weapon. This was a boy, a survivor, a prisoner. This was Izuku Midoriya, the legend, the boogeyman, the child who had broken a city. He hadn't been vaporized. He had been here. All this time. Alone in the tomb he had created, Wolverine's entire body went rigid. Every predatory instinct, every survival mechanism honed over a century of battle, was screaming at him. It wasn't the boy himself, but the power radiating from him, a silent, crushing weight that felt like the universe holding its breath. It was wrong. It was a violation of the natural order. His senses screamed threat, threat, threat on a loop. But Jean felt something else entirely. She reached out with her telepathy, gently brushing against the boy's mind. She couldn't get in. The kinetic static was like a psychic fortress wall, but she could feel the emotions bleeding off him. It wasn't malice. It wasn't rage. It was a tsunami of guilt so vast it threatened to drown her. It was a decade of undiluted self-loathing, of soul-crushing loneliness, and a fear so absolute it had calcified into his very being. She felt the ghost of his own psychic scream from that day, still echoing in the hollows of his soul. He was terrified of himself. Scott, ever the leader, took a single, cautious step forward. He raised a placating hand. "We're not here to hurt you," he said, his voice calm and even. The reaction was instantaneous. The boy, Izuku, flinched. A barely perceptible tremor ran through his body, and the world groaned in response. The null kinetic field around him intensified, the shimmer becoming a visible, vibrating lens. The ground beneath their feet trembled, not with a quake, but with a deep, resonant hum. The entire skeletal structure of the apartment building strained, steel girders screeching as unimaginable forces were placed upon them. The piece of rebar frozen in the air didn't just hang. It began to subtly distort, its very atomic structure under protest. The X-Men froze. They were 4 of the most powerful mutants on the planet, and they were utterly, completely at the mercy of a terrified teenager's reflexive twitch. Izuku looked at them, tears welling in his bright green eyes, tracing paths through the grime on his cheeks. His lips parted, and a voice, raspy and cracked from years of disuse, whispered out into the dead, silent air. It wasn't a threat. It was a desperate, heartbreaking warning. "Stay back," he pleaded, his voice trembling with the effort of holding his own power in check. "Or you'll get broken too." The man in the red glasses. No, they were not glasses, they were a visor, sleek and ruby quartz, spoke, and his voice was a stone skipping across the dead, silent lake of Izuku's world. It was calm. Measured. It held no malice. And that, more than anything, was what broke the dam. For 10 years, Izuku Midoriya had lived in a world of ghosts and echoes. He had held conversations with the memory of his mother, debated hero ethics with the faded poster of All Might on his ruined wall, and argued with the phantom jeers of his childhood bully. But this voice was real. It was solid. It was here. Then came the feeling. It was not a sound, not a sight, but a presence brushing against the storm wall of his mind. It was gentle, a warm hand offered to a feral animal. It didn't try to force its way in. It simply knocked. It radiated a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a decade: empathy. Understanding. The memories, held back for so long by the sheer force of his will and the crushing weight of his guilt, came flooding forth. Not as a sequence, but as a single, all-consuming wave. The world of gray rubble and colorful intruders dissolved, and he was drowning in the past. My name is Izuku Midoriya, and the first thing I ever wanted to be was a hero. It was a dream born in the bright, sunlit world before the silence. A world that smelled of my mother's katsudon and the clean, electric scent of the city after a summer rain. My room was a shrine. Every wall was covered with posters of heroes. Not just the famous ones, the mutants with powers that could bend reality, but the human ones, too. Captain America, his shield a perfect symbol of stalwart defense. And above them all, him. All Might. In our world, All Might wasn't a mutant. He had no powers, no X-gene. He was the pinnacle of human potential, a man who had trained his body and mind to impossible heights. His smile was a force of nature, a promise that everything would be okay. He was proof. Proof that you didn't need godlike powers to save people. You just needed the will. You needed a heart that refused to give up. That was the dream. It was my sun, my moon, my stars. And then, the day came when my sky went dark. I remember the doctor's office. It smelled of antiseptic and shattered hopes. The doctor was a portly man with a thick mustache who spoke to my mother like I wasn't even there. He put an X-ray up on the light board. It was a picture of my foot. You see this joint here, in his pinky toe? He said, tapping the film with a pen. It's a relic of a bygone era. Humans who develop powers, or quirks as we used to call them, don't have it. It's a reliable indicator. Izuka here, he's a baseline human. No latent X-gene. No quirk factor. He's going to be normal. You should be relieved. Relieved. The word hit me like a physical blow. The drive home was a blur of silent tears. My mother kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror, her face a mask of worry. I clutched my All Might action figure so hard its plastic edges dug into my palm, the toy's permanent, painted-on smile a cruel mockery. That night, I sat in my computer chair, the room dark except for the flickering monitor. I watched the video. The one I'd seen 1,000 times. All Might, emerging from the wreckage of a disaster, a dozen people cradled in his massive arms. He was laughing, his signature booming laugh that chased away the shadows. Why am I smiling? He'd once said in an interview. Because in the face of overwhelming danger, the people need a symbol. They need to see that someone is not afraid. I swiveled my chair around to face my mother, who was standing in the doorway, her silhouette haloed by the light from the hall. I pointed a trembling finger at the screen. The tears I'd been holding back finally broke free, hot and heavy down my cheeks. Mom! My voice was a small, broken thing. Can I still be a hero? She rushed forward, her own tears falling, and wrapped me in her arms. She held me tight, her body shaking with sobs. I'm sorry, Izuku! She cried, her words muffled in my hair. I'm so sorry! It wasn't the answer I wanted. It was the answer that told me the truth. The world was made of people with powers, and people without. And I was on the wrong side of the line, but the dream didn't die. It just changed. It became smaller, quieter. Maybe I couldn't be All Might. But I could still help. I could be a police officer. A doctor. I could still save people. I started to fill notebooks, analyzing heroes, their powers, their tactics. If I couldn't have power myself, I would understand it better than anyone. It was my own way of fighting back against the world that had told me no. And then, the universe played its cruelest joke. It began subtly. A weird hum under my skin when I got angry or scared. Sometimes, when I'd reach for a glass of water, it would feel lighter than it should. Once, a pencil rolled off my desk and I flinched, and it just stopped, a centimeter from the floor, before dropping. I blinked, and told myself I'd imagined it. I was a baseline human. The doctor said so, my pinky toe said so. This was just wishful thinking. A desperate mind playing tricks on itself. I was 14 on the day the world broke. It was a perfectly normal Tuesday. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. School had just let out, and I was walking home, my mind replaying the day's usual torments. Katsuki Bakugo, my childhood friend and lifelong tormentor, had been particularly cruel. He had an explosive mutant power. He could secrete nitroglycerin like sweat and ignite it at will. He was everything I wasn't: powerful, confident, destined for greatness. He called me Deku, a word that meant useless. It was a brand he'd seared into my soul. I was scribbling in my notebook, muttering analyses of a new hero who'd debuted that week, when I heard the screech. It was a horrifying, metallic scream. I looked up. A huge delivery truck had lost its brakes coming down the hill at the end of the street. It was careening out of control, its horn blaring uselessly, and it was heading straight for an intersection where a group of kids from the elementary school were crossing, including Bakugo. He stood frozen, his usual arrogant sneer replaced by a mask of pure, wide-eyed terror. I didn't think. There was no time. My legs were moving before my brain caught up. People were screaming, running away. My body was running towards the danger. My notebook fell from my hands, pages scattering on the pavement like fallen leaves. I have to do something. The thought was a prayer, a desperate plea to a universe that had never listened. Even if I'm useless. Even if I'm quirkless. I have to try. I ran out in front of the truck, planting my feet, my arms held out wide as if I could stop tons of speeding metal with my bare, skinny hands. It was a stupid, suicidal gesture, an act of a boy who had watched too many cartoons. In the last second before impact, as the massive grille of the truck filled my vision and the world compressed into a single moment of terror, something inside me answered. It wasn't a feeling of power. It was a feeling of emptiness. A profound, bottomless void opened in the core of my being. It was a hunger. And the speeding truck was its first meal. The kinetic energy of the vehicle, the sheer force of its momentum, didn't hit me. It flowed into me. I felt a pulling sensation, a violent cosmic inhale, and the truck just stopped. Its tires were still smoking, its engine still roaring, but it stopped dead, its bumper a mere inch from my outstretched fingers. Silence. The blaring horn cut out. The world held its breath, and the hunger grew. The void inside me wasn't satisfied. It reached out, and the world began to pour into it. I felt the screech of the tires, the sound waves themselves, being pulled from the air and into my body. The panicked shouts of the onlookers followed, their cries dying in their throats, as the very vibrations of their vocal cords were siphoned into me. Then came the wind. I felt the breeze rustling the leaves on the trees, the gentle currents of air flowing down the street. That too was drawn in, the air becoming unnaturally still, heavy, and dead. The leaves froze in place. My mind, my small human consciousness, was reeling. It was too much information, too much sensation. It was like trying to drink the entire ocean through a straw. But it wouldn't stop. I felt the flutter of a pigeon's wings taking flight 3 blocks away. I felt the rhythmic thumping of a jackhammer at a construction site a mile to the west. I felt the frantic, panicked heartbeats of everyone on the street, the rush of blood through their veins, the tiny kinetic transfers of every cell in their bodies. I felt Bakugo's heart, a terrified drum solo pounding against his ribs. It all flowed into me. I was the center of a silent, invisible vortex of motion. My body began to shake. A low hum started in my chest, a deep, resonant thrum of contained power. My vision blurred. The world was a smear of color and light. The hunger went deeper, past the city, past the surface. I felt the slow, inexorable grind of the tectonic plates miles beneath my feet. I felt the subtle kinetic force of the Earth's rotation on its axis. I was connected to everything. Every single moving thing. And it was all pouring into the 14-year-old boy who had been told he was nothing. The power was a star inside me. A white-hot, raging sun of pure force, packed into the fragile container of my body. It hurt. Oh God, it hurt. It was a pressure beyond imagining, a feeling of being filled to bursting and then beyond. My bones creaked. My muscles screamed. I felt like I was going to tear apart at the seams. I had to let it go. But I didn't know how. It was a language I didn't speak, a muscle I didn't know I had. I tried to scream for help, to tell someone to run, but the sound was just more fuel for the fire. The vibration of my own voice was absorbed back into the raging core inside me. I squeezed my eyes shut. Tears of agony streamed down my face. Mom. All Might. Somebody, help me. My control broke. I let out a silent, desperate scream. And with it, the star inside me detonated. But it wasn't an explosion. An explosion is a release, a pushing outward. This was different. This was a cancellation. A reset. The world didn't erupt in fire and light. It folded. For a single, eternal microsecond, I felt it happen. The compressive wave. It wasn't a sound, but an absence of sound. It wasn't a shockwave, but a crushing wall of pure stillness that radiated out from me at the speed of thought. I felt the building to my left, a 10-story office complex, not blow apart, but compress. Its structural integrity vanished. The potential energy holding it up was instantly negated. It simply pancaked. 10 stories of concrete and steel became a 2-story pile of dust and twisted metal in less time than it takes to blink. There was no boom. Just a soft, final whump. I felt the asphalt of the road buckle, not from heat, but from the immense, silent pressure. I felt the cars on the street crumple like tin cans in a vise. I felt the trees splinter, their kinetic life force extinguished. And the people, I didn't feel them burn. I didn't feel them torn apart. I felt them thrown. Violently. As if the world's gravity had suddenly multiplied by 1,000 and slammed them against whatever was nearest. Their motion, their very existence, was broken. The wave expanded, silent and unstoppable. It flattened my school. My apartment building. My favorite comic book shop. The park where I used to play. My entire world. My entire life. It all came down in a single, deafening moment of absolute silence. And then blackness. I woke to a world of gray. Gray dust coated my tongue. Gray ash filled my lungs. A gray, sunless sky hung above me, choked with the pulverized remains of the city. I was lying on my back in the middle of what used to be the street. My first thought was villain attack. A big one. I sat up. My body ached with a deep, profound exhaustion, as if I'd run a marathon in every direction at once. I looked around, and my blood ran cold. There was no rubble. Not in the traditional sense. No large, recognizable chunks of buildings. Everything was just flattened. Pulverized. The landscape was a uniform, undulating plain of gray debris, punctuated by the mangled steel skeletons of what used to be skyscrapers. It was my neighborhood. I recognized the twisted frame of the overpass I walked under every day. I could see the outline of where my school should be, now just a slightly higher mound of dust. I was at the center of it all. The very epicenter. The memories came back then, not as a flood, but as a series of horrifying snapshots. The truck. The pulling sensation. The star in my chest. The silent scream. No. It can't be. I scrambled to my feet. My legs were shaky. Mom? I called out, my voice a dry croak. The sound was swallowed by the oppressive silence. Bakugo? Anyone? There was no answer. There was nothing. Just the whisper of the wind over the ruins of my life. It was me. I did this. The boy who wanted to be a hero had become a monster. A god of destruction. The world's most powerful villain, and my first and only act was to obliterate my entire world. I sank to my knees, the sharp edges of the debris digging into my skin. A dry, racking sob tore through me, but no tears came. I felt hollowed out, a shell filled with nothing but dust and horror. I don't know how long I knelt there. Hours? A day? Time had lost its meaning. The gray sky never changed. Eventually, I heard a new sound. The distant, approaching wail of sirens. Hope. A stupid, desperate flicker of it. Maybe someone survived. Maybe they could help me. Maybe they could fix this. Fix me. I saw them cresting a hill of rubble in the distance. First responders in heavy, protective gear. They moved slowly, cautiously, their flashlights cutting beams through the haze. I stood up and waved my arms. Here! I shouted, my voice raw. I'm here! Please help! The figures stopped. Their flashlight beams converged on me. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a voice crackled over a loudspeaker, distorted and metallic. Subject is at the epicenter. Confirmed visual. It's just a child. They started moving towards me. I took a stumbling step towards them, a sense of relief washing over me. They were here to help. Everything would be. Then I saw their faces through their visors. I saw the awe. The disbelief. And the raw, undiluted terror. They weren't looking at a survivor. They weren't looking at a victim. They were looking at the crater left by a meteor, and realizing the meteor was standing right in front of them. One of them raised a hand and pointed at me. His voice, unamplified but carried on the dead air, was shaking. "Oni," he whispered. "A demon." The word shattered the last of my desperate hope. They weren't here to rescue me. They were here because of me. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was a containment operation. I was the disaster. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. I turned and ran. I ran away from the lights, away from the voices, away from the fear in their eyes. I stumbled and fell over the uneven ground, my hands and knees raw and bleeding, but I kept going. I ran deeper into the gray wasteland I had created. I found what was left of my apartment building. It was one of the few structures that still had a recognizable shape, a hollowed-out concrete husk. I crawled inside, into the darkness, and collapsed. This was my home. This was my tomb. The days that followed blurred into a nightmare of grief and self-loathing. I learned that my power, this curse, was always on. It was a low hum beneath my skin, a constant hunger for motion. If I moved too quickly, I could feel the pull, the void wanting to open again. If I got angry, I felt the star in my chest begin to glow. I had to control it. I had to cage it. I did the opposite of what I did during the catastrophe. Instead of absorbing, I pushed back. I focused all my will inward, creating a bubble of stillness around me. A field where nothing could move. It was exhausting, a constant mental battle. But it was the only way. It was my penance. My eternal prison sentence. I lived like a ghost in my own graveyard. I ate canned food I found in the pantries of crushed homes. I drank rainwater that pooled in bent steel girders. I spent a decade in absolute solitude, with nothing but the ghosts of my past and the crushing weight of my guilt for company. The name they gave me, Deku, was no longer an insult from a bully. It was the truth. It was what I was. Useless. Worse than useless. A force of pure destruction. The world outside moved on. I saw the massive walls they built around the city, the warning signs, the patrols. They quarantined my failure. They buried my sin under a new name, the Muzutafu Quarantine Zone. They thought I was dead, a ghost story to frighten new mutants. They were right. The boy named Izuka Midoriya did die that day. Only the monster remained. The flood of memory receded, leaving him gasping for air in the present. The X-Men were still there, frozen in place. The one in the visor, the woman with the red hair, the man with the wild hair and metal claws, the woman with the white hair who floated an inch off the ground. Heroes. They had come to the tomb of a monster, looking for a weapon or a ghost. And they had found a broken boy. He saw the calculation in the visor man's eyes. He saw the deep, soul-shaking pity in the red-haired woman's expression. He saw the predator's caution in the feral man's stance. They were analyzing him. Assessing him. Trying to figure out what he was. He had to make them understand. They couldn't try to help him. They couldn't get close. He was a bomb that had already gone off once and left a crater the size of a city. The second time, it could be the world. He looked at them, at the vibrant colors of their uniforms, at the hope and strength they represented. Everything he had ever wanted to be. And he gave them the only truth he had left. The lesson he had learned in a decade of silent, gray-dusted hell. "I'm not a person," he whispered, the words tasting of ash and finality. "I'm a weapon that already fired." The two words hung in the dead air, a confession and a verdict spoken in a single, rasping breath. Broken, too, Scott Summers' mind, a machine honed for tactical analysis and rapid-fire decision-making, went completely blank for a full second. All his training, all his experience fighting Sentinels, the Brood, Magneto himself, none of it had a protocol for this. How do you de-escalate a negotiation when the other party is a living, breathing tectonic event holding itself together with nothing but terrified willpower? "Hold position," he commanded, his voice a low subvocalization through his comm link, a sound that wouldn't disturb the fragile peace. "No one moves. No one speaks. Logan, retract." He heard a low growl in his ear. "Claws ain't out, Scott. But everything inside me is telling me to either run like hell or go for the throat. This kid, he's breaking the laws of physics just by sitting there." Logan was right. The pressure in the air was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of pure potential. The building around them continued to emit low, groaning protests, the sound of stressed metal and compressed concrete. Ororo, floating just off the ground, had her eyes closed, her face a mask of intense concentration. The air is a statue. She sent over the link, her voice tight. There are no currents. No temperature gradients. The planet's rotation should be causing a Coriolis effect, but there is nothing. It is a perfect vacuum of motion. I cannot touch it. They were out of their depth. This wasn't a fight. It was a vigil at the bedside of an unstable god. One wrong move, one loud noise, one flicker of aggression, and Izuku Midoriya could unmake them all without even trying. The catastrophe wasn't an act of power, it was a loss of it, and he was holding on to the reins with bleeding hands. Scott's gaze flickered to Jean. She was their only viable option. Brute force was suicide. Elemental power was useless. But the mind, the heart, that was a different battlefield. Jean! He whispered into the calm. Can you get through to him? He saw her nod, a minute, almost imperceptible motion. Her eyes were closed, her brow furrowed. The static is immense, Scott. It's not just a wall, it's a storm. His power is so integrated with his consciousness that trying to read his thoughts is like trying to read a book in the heart of a jet engine. But I can feel his emotions. They are raw. Unfiltered. Then don't read. Scott decided, his own heart pounding against his ribs. Give. Show him. Show him he's not the only one who's ever been afraid of the power inside them. It was a massive risk. Opening a telepathic channel to an Omega-level mutant of this instability was like plugging a toaster into a supernova. But it was the only play they had. Jean took a deep, centering breath. She had spent years building psychic walls, learning to shield herself and others. Now, she had to do the opposite. She had to tear one down, and in its place build a bridge. She reached out, not with a probe, but with an offering. As her consciousness brushed against the roaring static of Izuku's mind, she was assaulted by the sheer chaos of it. It wasn't just noise, it was the psychic manifestation of his power. It felt of grinding continents, of screaming atoms, of the infinite, silent fall of gravity. It was the sound of a universe of motion being held in a single, agonizing point. But she pushed through, not with force, but with vulnerability. She didn't send words. She didn't send images. She sent a memory. A feeling. She sent fire, the sun on her face. A picnic with Scott on the mansion grounds. Laughter. The taste of iced tea. Safety. Love. A perfect, simple moment, and then the change, the fire in her blood. A cosmic awareness expanding her mind past the breaking point. The voice that was not her voice, whispering secrets of creation in her ear. The glorious, terrifying power singing through her veins, a symphony of stars and nebulae. The feeling of being able to hold a galaxy in the palm of her hand. Then the fear, the flicker of a thought. An errant spark of anger at a foe. And the uncontrollable inferno that erupted in response. The power, her power, turning on her, using her as a vessel. The horrified screams of her teammates, as they were swatted aside like flies. The taste of ash and ozone. The gut-wrenching, soul-shattering realization that she was no longer Jean Grey. She was a passenger in her own body, and the driver was a hungry, burning god. She sent him the memory of looking at her own hands and seeing not flesh and blood, but the roiling surface of a star. She sent him the terror of knowing that the people she loved most in the universe were in more danger from her than from any enemy they had ever faced. She sent him the crushing, isolating weight of being a weapon too powerful to control, a danger to the very fabric of existence. She sent him her own guilt. Her own brokenness. Izuku gasped. The feeling that had been gently knocking at the storm wall of his mind suddenly seeped through the cracks. It wasn't an invasion. It was a resonance. For 10 years, his guilt had been a solitary confinement. He was the only one. The singular monster. The unique failure. He had believed his pain was his and his alone, a burden no one else could possibly comprehend. He was wrong. Through the psychic static, he felt her. The woman with the fiery red hair. He felt her power, a furnace of cosmic scale that dwarfed his own in its sheer creative and destructive potential, and he felt her terror. It was his terror. The same cold, gut-hollowing dread of losing control. The same self-loathing that came after the destruction. The same agonizing loneliness of being feared by those you wanted to protect. He saw, for a fleeting moment, an image in his mind's eye, the woman, wreathed in the form of a magnificent, terrible bird of fire, tears streaming down her face as she looked upon a world she had nearly unmade. She understood. A single, hot tear escaped his eye and rolled down his cheek. The first tear he had shed in a decade. As it fell, it did something impossible in his world. It moved. It left a glistening track on his dusty skin before it reached his jaw and hung there, trembling. The pressure in the room lessened by a fraction. The groaning of the building subsided to a low hum. It was a change so subtle that only those as attuned as the X-Men would notice. Jean's eyes snapped open. She met Scott's gaze and gave a single, sharp nod. "I'm in." "The professor can reach him now," Scott keyed the calm. "Professor. We have a window." Back in the quiet serenity of the Jean Grey School, Charles Xavier sat in his hover chair, his fingers steepled before him, his eyes closed in deep concentration. Cerebro hummed around him, not as a search engine, but as an amplifier, focusing his immense psychic power across the globe, through Jean, and into the shattered heart of Muzurifu. Izuku felt a new presence. This one was different. It wasn't the fiery empathy of the woman. It was a vast, calm, and ancient mind. It felt like a deep, still ocean, impossibly powerful but utterly serene. It didn't push. It didn't pull. It simply was. And then, a voice spoke, not in the air, but in the center of his soul. It was a kind, steady voice, filled with an authority that came not from command, but from wisdom. "Hello, Izuku. My name is Charles Xavier. I am so very sorry for what you have endured." Izuku flinched, but the voice was a balm, not a threat. It knew his name. "I felt your psychic cry, all those years ago," the voice continued, laced with a profound and genuine regret. "A mind with your potential, screaming in agony. By the time I pinpointed your location, the authorities had sealed the area. They listed you as deceased. I have long considered it one of my greatest failures that I did not search for you myself. This was too much. Sympathy. Regret. Understanding. It was a flood of human connection after a decade-long drought, and he was drowning in it. We are not here to hurt you, or to contain you," Xavier's voice resonated in his mind. "We are here to offer you something you have been denied. A choice." A choice? His only choice had been to sit still or break the world. "The power you possess is extraordinary, Izuku. It is a part of you, like your heart or your lungs. To fear it is to fear yourself. To cage it is to build a prison around your own soul. You have spent 10 years doing just that, and your courage in doing so is beyond measure. But there is another way." A flicker of hope, so alien he almost didn't recognize it, sparked in Izuku's chest. "Come with us," Xavier offered. "Come to my school. It is a place where young people like yourself learn to understand their gifts. We will not teach you how to suppress your power. We will teach you how to master it. Your mind is analytical. You crave knowledge. We will give you the tools, physics, biology, meditative techniques, to dissect your ability, to understand it from the atomic level upwards. We will help you turn your prison into a fortress. We can give you what you want more than anything else." The voice paused, letting the final, critical word land with the weight of a prayer answered. "Control. Control." The word echoed in the silent chambers of his heart. To be able to walk without fear of shattering the ground. To be able to speak without absorbing the sound. To be able to live without the constant, crushing terror of breaking everything he touched. It was a fantasy, a dream he hadn't dared to have since he was a child. He was actually considering it. The thought itself was terrifying. To leave his cage? To trust these strangers? To let the world back in? Before he could formulate an answer, the world outside the building made the choice for him. A new sound ripped through the silence of Muzurifu. It was a sound Izuku hadn't heard in years, the rhythmic, percussive whump-whump-whump of helicopter blades. It started as a distant thrum and grew rapidly into a deafening roar. 4 sleek, black helicopters, bearing no national insignia but the stark, stylized letters JMRD, swooped over the ruins. They were military-grade, attack models bristling with advanced-looking weaponry. Simultaneously, the sounds of heavy engines echoed from the perimeter as a convoy of armored personnel carriers, painted in the same matte black, churned over the rubble, their heavy treads crushing the decade-old debris. Wolverine's head snapped up, a feral snarl twisting his lips. "Company's here. And they ain't sellin' cookies." The helicopter side doors slid open, revealing squads of soldiers in full body, high-tech armor that looked more like something out of science fiction than a standard military uniform. They rappelled down to the ground with practiced, silent efficiency, forming a perimeter around the shattered apartment building. They carried weapons that didn't look like conventional firearms. They were bulky, rifle-like devices with strange, triple-pronged emitters at the end. A voice, amplified and chillingly impersonal, boomed from a loudspeaker on the lead APC. "X-Men! You are in violation of Japanese sovereign law and the Mutant Quarantine Charter. You are harboring a Class Omega bioweapon. Power down your abilities and surrender the asset immediately. You have 1 minute." Scott's jaw tightened. He stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between the approaching soldiers and the building where Izuku was hidden. "He is a boy, not an asset," Scott yelled back, his voice cutting through the noise. "He is a victim who needs help, and he is under our protection." The commander of the JMRD force, a man in a more ornate version of the armor with a crimson stripe down his helmet, stepped out from behind an APC. He raised his weapon. "He is the entity responsible for the death of over 5,000 civilians and the complete destruction of this district. He forfeited his right to be called a boy 10 years ago. This is your only warning. Surrender the asset, or we will neutralize you and retrieve it from your corpses." The threat was absolute. Izuku, watching from the shadows of his concrete shell, felt a fresh wave of ice-cold panic. He knew these men. He had seen them from a distance for years, patrolling the quarantine walls. They were the keepers of his tomb. "Izuku, stay calm," Xavier's voice urged in his mind, but it was strained now. "Do not let them provoke you. My X-Men will handle this." But Izuku couldn't stay calm. The arrival of the soldiers, the noise, the aggression, it was all kinetic energy. The roar of the engines, the shouts, the pounding of boots on the ground, the vibrations from the helicopters, it was all pressing in on his null field, a constant, irritating pressure. His control, already fragile, was beginning to fray. "They're not going to listen to reason," Logan growled over the comm, his body coiled like a spring. "What's the play, Scott?" "We're not handing him over," Scott said, his voice hard as iron. He adjusted his visor. "We protect him. We get him to the Blackbird. We leave." The JMRD commander must have seen his defiant posture. He gave a sharp, downward chop with his hand. "Engage. Subdue the X-Men. Activate the dampeners. Prioritize the asset." "Dampeners?" Jean asked, her eyes widening. They got their answer a second later. The emitters on the soldiers' rifles began to glow with a sickly, purple light. They fired in unison. They didn't fire bullets or beams of energy. They fired waves of nothing. Waves of forced stillness, crude, weaponized versions of the very field Izuku was generating. The waves washed over the area. For the X-Men, it felt strange, like moving through molasses. But for Izuku, it was agony. It was like two massive, opposing magnetic fields being slammed together. His null kinetic field, a finely tuned bubble of absolute control maintained by a decade of practice, was violently assaulted. The JMRD's dampening field tried to impose its own artificial stillness over his, and the resulting feedback was excruciating. Izuku screamed, a real, audible scream this time. The psychic static around his mind exploded, forcing Jean and Xavier out with the force of a mental bomb. His control shattered. The world lurched. The ground beneath the JMRD soldiers buckled violently. The air crackled, visible distortions warping the space around Izuku. The hanging piece of rebar in the atrium began to vibrate, emitting a high-pitched shriek as it was pulled apart at a molecular level. "It's him!" the commander yelled. "He's losing control! Focus fire! Pin him down!" The soldiers poured their dampening energy towards the building. It only made it worse. Izuku clutched his head, his body shaking uncontrollably. The power inside him, the caged star, was fighting against the external pressure, threatening to detonate. The X-Men were forced into action. Scott's optic blast, a beam of pure kinetic force, lanced out. He wasn't aiming at the soldiers. He was aiming at their weapons. A precise shot struck one of the dampener rifles, causing it to explode in a shower of sparks. Storm rose into the air, her eyes glowing white. She couldn't create a storm inside the dead zone, but she could outside of it. The sky above the quarantine walls, previously clear, darkened in an instant. Lightning spiderwebbed across the clouds. It was a warning. Wolverine was a berserker whirlwind. He moved faster than the JMRD soldiers could track, disabling them with non-lethal efficiency. He used the flat of his claws to smash weapons, the pommels of his fists to strike nerve clusters. He was a force of nature, but there were too many of them. Izuku watched the chaos unfold, his vision blurring with pain and tears. These people, these heroes, they had come and offered him hope, a choice. And his answer had been to bring more violence down upon them. He was a curse. A nexus of destruction. Everyone who came near him got hurt. The Purifiers. Now the X-Men. He saw one of the soldiers get a clear shot at the floating woman. The purple dampening wave hit Ororo squarely, and her control over the weather faltered. She cried out and fell from the sky, landing hard on the rubble. Logan roared and charged the soldier who fired, but two others intercepted him, pinning him with their combined fire. That was the breaking point, seeing them fight for him. Seeing them get hurt for him. For the monster in the ruins. For the boy who broke everything. A new feeling rose through the pain and the panic. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced since he'd run out in front of that truck. It wasn't the desire to be a hero. It was the simple, overwhelming need to help. He had to stop this. Not them. Him. He had two choices. He could let go, let the star inside him detonate, and end it all, the soldiers, the X-Men, the ruins, maybe all of Japan. Or he could do the single most terrifying thing he could imagine. He could trust them. He had to turn off the cage. He squeezed his eyes shut, ignoring the agonizing feedback from the dampeners. He focused inward, past the pain, to the core of his power. For 10 years, his will had been a dam, holding back the ocean. Now, he had to open the floodgates. Not all the way. Just a crack. With a final, guttural cry that was equal parts effort and terror, he did it. He consciously, deliberately, let go. The null kinetic field that had been his prison and his shield for a decade collapsed. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The crushing pressure that had defined the center of Muzutafu for 10 years vanished. The air, thick and stagnant, suddenly moved. A breeze, the first in a decade, swirled through the ruins, carrying the scent of dust and decay. The laws of physics, so long held in abeyance, rushed back in with a vengeance. Every JMRD soldier, every X-Man, stumbled as the world suddenly felt right again. The ground beneath their feet vibrated with the thrum of the nearby helicopters. The sounds of the battle were suddenly sharp and clear. Izuku fell to his knees, gasping, the strain of releasing his control just as exhausting as maintaining it. He felt naked. Vulnerable. Every vibration, every motion, was a potential spark next to the powder keg he held inside. He pushed himself to his feet and stumbled out from the shadows of the ruined building into the light. He was trembling from head to toe, but he stood tall. He raised his hands, not in surrender, but in a plea. "Stop," he said, his voice surprisingly clear and steady. He looked first at the JMRA commander. "Please stop fighting." Then he turned his gaze to the X-Men. To the man with the visor who had stood his ground. To the woman with red hair who had shown him he wasn't alone. To the fierce, feral man who was still fighting for him. His choice was made. "I'll go," he said, his green eyes locking with Scott's. "I'll go with you." It was not a surrender. It was a leap of faith across a chasm of fear, and for the first time in 10 years, Izuku Midoriya felt the faint, terrifying, and exhilarating sensation of falling forward. The flight back from Japan was the longest 12 hours of Izuku Midoriya's life. Longer than any of the 3,652 days he had spent in his concrete tomb. Solitude had been a crushing, monolithic weight, but it had been a familiar one. This This was a new and terrifying universe of sensation. He sat in one of the Blackbird's passenger seats, a thick, insulated blanket draped over his thin shoulders by the woman with the white hair, Ororo. He was an island of stillness in a sea of motion. The low, constant vibration of the jet's engines thrummed through the floor, a persistent hum that felt like a lion purring against his bones. The gentle sway of the aircraft as it navigated the upper atmospheric currents was a lurching reminder of the catastrophic power of momentum. The quiet hiss of the recycled air, the soft clicks of instrumentation, the very heartbeats of the 5 other people in the cabin. It was a symphony of kinetic energy that his power, his hunger, yearned to consume. He kept his eyes squeezed shut, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists on his lap. He was a recovering addict locked in a distillery. Every instinct screamed at him to reinstate his null field, to retreat back into the familiar, safe silence of his cage. But he had made a promise. A choice. He had to learn to live in the world, not to hide from it. So he focused on his breathing, just as the kind voice of Professor Xavier had instructed him to do through the telepathic link Jean had established. Inhale the stillness, Izuku. Exhale the motion. You are not a container. You are a conduit. Let the energy of the world flow around you, not into you. You are a stone in a stream, not a dam holding back the river. It was a beautiful sentiment, but to Izuku, it felt like being told to ignore the fact that the stream was a tsunami, and the stone was made of sugar glass. His arrival at the Jean Grey School for Higher Learning was less of an introduction and more of a radiological event. As the Blackbird descended towards the lush, green grounds of the Westchester estate, a ripple of awareness spread through the student body. The younger students, those who had only heard the stories, felt a strange, inexplicable pressure in the air, a subtle shift in barometric pressure that made the hairs on their arms stand up. The older students, the telepaths and empaths, felt something far more profound. They felt the psychic equivalent of a black hole cresting the horizon, a point of immense gravity, not of malice, but of monumental, contained power and an ocean of sorrow. When the ramp lowered and he walked out, blinking in the unfamiliar brightness of the afternoon sun, a hush fell over the assembled students who had gathered to greet the returning X-Men. They saw the legends, Cyclops, Jean Grey, Storm, Wolverine. And then they saw the ghost. He was just a boy, impossibly thin and pale, swallowed by a borrowed gray sweatsuit. But the stories had been told in hushed whispers in the dorms for years. The Deku. The living catastrophe. The boy who broke a city by accident. He was the ultimate cautionary tale, the Omega-level boogeyman that teachers used to underscore the importance of control. He was their what if. What if we fail? What if we lose control? What if we become the monster the world fears we are? And now he was here, walking on their lawn. Izuku felt their stares like 1,000 tiny needles. He saw awe, morbid curiosity, and most of all, he saw fear. It was the same fear he had seen in the eyes of the first responders a decade ago. He instinctively flinched, pulling the blanket tighter around himself, and a dozen students in the front row flinched in response, as if expecting the ground to crack open. He lowered his head, his wild green hair falling over his eyes, and focused on putting one foot in front of the other. Professor Xavier was there to greet him, his presence a beacon of calm in the storm of Izuku's anxiety. He offered a warm, genuine smile that didn't quite reach his worried eyes. "Welcome to the Jean Grey School, Izuku," he said, his voice as kind in person as it had been in Izuku's mind. "This is your home now, for as long as you wish it to be. You are safe here." Izuku wanted to believe him. But as he looked around at the beautiful, historic mansion, at the vibrant, powerful students, he didn't feel safe. He felt like a lit stick of dynamite in a museum full of priceless art. The only thing he could do to keep everyone else safe was to stay as far away from them as possible. His first days were a lesson in isolation. He was given a sparse, reinforced room in a medically quarantined section of the sub-basement, away from the main dormitories. It had a bed, a desk, and a window that showed a clever, holographic projection of the sky. He ate his meals alone, the food left on a tray outside his door. He saw only a handful of people. Professor Xavier for his initial mental and emotional assessments, Jean Grey, who acted as a telepathic buffer, helping him filter the overwhelming psychic noise of the mansion, and Dr. Hank McCoy, Beast, with his combination of genius-level intellect and gentle, scholarly demeanor, was the first person Izuku felt he could almost relax around. Perhaps it was because Hank's own fearsome appearance was so at odds with his soft-spoken nature. He understood what it was like to be judged by the potential for destruction you represented. The lab they used was less of a laboratory and more of a bunker. It was a spherical chamber deep beneath the school, shielded with layers of vibranium, adamantium, and reactive kinetic dampeners. Fascinating, Hank murmured, peering at a series of complex equations floating on a holographic display. He, Izuku, and a gruff, tech-savvy mutant named Forge were the only ones cleared to be in the chamber during the initial tests. Izuku stood on a platform in the center of the room, wired with a dozen sensors. Your ability isn't merely the absorption of kinetic energy, Hank explained, his initial clinical detachment giving way to sheer scientific awe. That's like saying a star merely produces light. It is a fundamental reordering of physical law on a localized, quantum level. You don't just stop an object, you siphon its vector, its momentum, its potential energy, and its thermal byproduct into what appears to be a separate, biodimensional reservoir. Izuku, do you feel a limit? A point where you are full? Izuku thought back to the catastrophe. To the feeling of the entire planet's motion pouring into him. He shook his head. No, he whispered, his voice still hoarse from disuse. It just hurts more, the more I take in. Forge, a man whose mutant power was an intuitive genius for invention, grunted from his console. Hurts is the understatement of the century, kid. The energy you vented during the Muzutafu event, even as a compressive wave, was measured in the multi-teraton range. You're a biological capacitor with a seemingly infinite charge, which brings us to the primary problem, Hank said, turning to face Izuku directly, his expression sobering. Release. Your only known method of releasing stockpiled energy is catastrophic. We need to find a way for you to bleed off energy in small, controlled increments. Like a valve, not a bomb. This was the beginning of his unlearning. For 10 years, his every waking moment had been dedicated to one singular goal: do not absorb. Now, he had to do the exact opposite. He had to learn to take in power, just a little, and then let it go safely. Their first attempt was with the danger room. The very name sent a shiver of fear down Izuku's spine. He stood alone in the vast, empty grid of the room. Scott, Ororo, and Hank watched from the heavily shielded observation booth. The scenario is simple, Scott's voice echoed from an intercom. A single, slow-moving projectile will be fired at you. Your only goal is to absorb its kinetic energy and hold it. Nothing more. We'll monitor your biofeedback and energy levels. If it spikes, we abort. Ready? Izuku nodded, his mouth dry. A small, softball-sized rubber ball was launched from a hidden panel in the wall. It flew towards him at a leisurely pace, no faster than a gentle toss. He reached out his hand, palm forward. He took a deep breath. Let the river flow into you, he thought, channeling the professor's words. The moment the ball touched his palm, the familiar void opened inside him. He felt the pull, the gentle but inexorable siphoning of the ball's momentum. The ball stopped dead against his skin, all its forward motion gone. It dropped to the floor with a soft thud. Success. A tiny, fragile bud of it. He had absorbed the energy. He could feel it inside him, a tiny, warm spark in the cold emptiness of his core. It was manageable. A single firefly in a vast, dark cave. Excellent, Izuku! Hank's voice was filled with encouragement. Now let's try something slightly faster. A second ball was launched, this time at the speed of a professional baseball pitch. Izuku braced himself. The impact was sharper, the influx of energy more pronounced. The firefly became a small candle flame, still manageable. They continued the test, gradually increasing the mass and velocity of the projectiles. Metal spheres. Small concrete blocks. Each time, Izuku successfully absorbed the impact. The candle flame grew to a torch, then a bonfire. The feeling was becoming uncomfortable, a familiar pressure building in his chest. His energy levels are approaching the Muzutafu initiation threshold, Hank warned from the booth. All right, Izuku, that's enough, Scott commanded. Abort the test. Just hold the energy. We'll work on dissipating it later. But something was wrong. Another panel hissed open in the wall, one that wasn't supposed to. A sleek, metallic projectile, the size of a small missile, shot out at supersonic speed, aimed directly at him. What is that? I didn't program that, Hank yelled. It was a danger room malfunction. A random, chaotic variable. Izuku didn't have time to think. He reacted on pure instinct. He threw his hands up, and the missile slammed into an invisible wall of force in front of him. The energy influx was a tidal wave. The bonfire in his chest roared into an inferno. The pain was immense, a blinding white-hot agony. He felt his control slipping. No! Not here! Not again! He screamed, not in his mind, but out loud. He had to get the energy out. He couldn't let it build. He remembered Hank's words, a valve, not a bomb. He focused all his will, all his desperation, on one of his fingers. He imagined a tiny pinprick in the dam. He flicked his finger at the far wall. The release was not what he expected. It wasn't an explosion. It was a silent, invisible cannon blast. A column of pure kinetic force, no bigger around than a dinner plate, erupted from his fingertip. It crossed 100 yards to the far wall in less than a microsecond. The impact was devastating. The wall of the danger room, made of a proprietary shear alloy designed to withstand a direct hit from Gladiator, simply vanished. Not shattered. Not melted. It was as if it had been perfectly and instantly erased from existence. A clean, circular hole now led to the bedrock of Westchester County beyond. A plume of vaporized rock and metal dust billowed back into the room. Silence. The emergency klaxons that should have been blaring were silent, their systems vaporized along with the wall. In the observation booth, Scott, Ororo, and Hank could only stare, their mouths agape. By the stars and comets, Ororo whispered. Izuku stared at his trembling hand, then at the hole in reality he had just created. He hadn't just punched through the wall. He had annihilated the matter by overloading it with pure kinetic force, blasting its atomic bonds apart. He had tried to open a valve and had created a railgun. He had failed. He had lost control. He had almost. He sank to his knees, his body shaking with reaction. He had almost killed them all. The danger room, the most advanced training facility on the planet, was too small. Too fragile. The school itself was too small. He was the problem. He was too dangerous. The boy needs a sparring partner, not a target range. The voice was a low, gravelly growl. Izuku was sitting in the infirmary, wrapped in another blanket, a cup of hot chocolate untouched on the table beside him. The hole in the danger room was the talk of the school. He could feel the fear and awe radiating from the other students, even through the thick walls. Logan stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame, his arms crossed. Professor Xavier was beside him. "Your logic is sound, Logan," Xavier said. "But who could possibly withstand a blow like that, should he miscalculate again?" Logan snorted, pushing himself off the doorframe and walking into the room. He stopped in front of Izuku, who shrank back in his seat. The feral X-man's gaze was intense, analytical. He wasn't looking at a broken child or a living weapon. He was looking at a fighter who didn't know how to fight. "Me," Logan stated simply. "He can't break what already heals. Bones on it. Organs will grow back. Besides, the kid's problem ain't about power. It's about fear. He's scared to move. Scared to breathe. He's been sitting still for so long he's forgotten how. You can't teach a cub to hunt by throwing berries at it. You gotta put it in the dirt with another predator." Izuku stared at him, bewildered. This man, Wolverine, was volunteering to be in a room with him? Willingly? Xavier considered it. It was unorthodox. Dangerous. But Logan had a point. Izuku's problem was psychological as much as it was physical. "Very well," Xavier agreed. "But not here. Not at the school. We'll use the old proving grounds in the Nevada desert." And so, Izuku's real training began. It was not in a lab or a high-tech simulator. It was under the blazing, empty sky of the desert, on a cracked salt flat that stretched to the horizon. His only company was Wolverine. The first day, Logan tossed him a simple wooden staff. "Pick it up," he grunted. Izuku hesitated, then slowly bent down and took the staff. It felt impossibly heavy, a repository of potential energy. "Hit me," Logan ordered. "What?" Izuku stammered. "No! I can't! I might break you." "You'll try," Logan growled, a predatory grin on his face. He popped his claws with a sharp snick. "Gives you something to aim for." For an hour, Logan taunted him, insulted him, prodded him. He called him a coward, a crybaby, a ghost hiding from his own shadow. He was trying to get a reaction, any reaction. Finally, with a cry of frustration, Izuku swung the staff. He tried to pull the blow, to make it weak, but his fear and anger gave it power. The moment the staff connected with Logan's outstretched arm, Izuku felt the familiar, horrifying pull. The energy of the swing, the sound of the impact, the resistance of bone and muscle, it all flooded into him. Logan's arm broke with a sickening crack. He was thrown back 10 feet, skidding across the salt flat. Izuku dropped the staff as if it were on fire, his eyes wide with horror. "I'm sorry! I'm so sorry! I told you!" Logan got to his feet, his arm already twisting back into place with a series of wet crunches. He shook it out and spat on the ground. "Good," he grunted, the grin never leaving his face. Again, day after day, this was their ritual. Logan didn't teach Izuku how to fight. He didn't teach him stances or forms or techniques. He was teaching him something far more fundamental. He was teaching him how to exist in a world of motion. He taught him how to stand. "Feel the ground under your feet, kid. Feel the spin of the earth. It's always there. Don't fight it. Don't absorb it. Just acknowledge it. Let it be." He taught him how to breathe. "Your lungs move. The air moves. It's energy. Let it flow in and out. Don't try to stop it. Be a part of the cycle." He was teaching him control through stillness. Not the artificial, forced stillness of his null field, but a meditative, internal stillness. A calm center in the hurricane of his power. "Your problem ain't the power, kid," Logan said one evening as they sat by a small campfire, the stars a brilliant canopy in the desert sky. "It's your head. You think too much. You analyze everything to death before you even do it." This struck Izuku to his core. Logan was right. His whole life, his only defense had been his mind, his analysis. He couldn't fight, so he studied fighters. He didn't have a power, so he studied powers. He pulled a fresh, untouched notebook from his bag. It was one of several Hank had given him. He had been too scared to even open them. Now, under the vast desert sky, away from the fragile world he was so afraid of breaking, an idea began to form. He opened the notebook to the first page. At the top, he wrote, "Mutant Analysis for the Future, Volume 1. And underneath that, he wrote his own name, Izuku Midoriya. Codename Deku. He began to write, not just about others, but about himself. He treated his own power as a puzzle to be solved. He drew diagrams. He wrote out the equations Hank had shown him. He theorized. He had been thinking of his power as a single, massive entity. A reservoir that could only be emptied by breaking the dam. But what if that was wrong? The focus beam he'd fired in the danger room, as destructive as it was, had been a revelation. It was controlled. Directed. He began to break it down. What if he could release the energy not through his whole body, but through a single part? What if he could channel a tiny fraction of the stockpiled power into his finger for a flick? Or into his fist for a punch? He started naming the theoretical techniques. He scribbled them down, his pen flying across the page. A 5% kinetic release through his finger, Delaware flick. A 10% release through his arm for a punch, Detroit smash. He was borrowing the names from American states and cities, a nod to the legendary All Might and his signature attacks. It felt right, like he was finally taking the broken pieces of his childhood dream and building something new. Then, a new thought struck him, a concept so revolutionary it made him stop breathing for a second. Stockpiling was the problem. The energy sat inside him, a ticking bomb. The null field was his way of preventing the bomb from being lit. But what if he didn't have to stockpile at all? What if he could let the energy flow through him? Absorb and release in a continuous, balance cycle? He could draw in ambient kinetic energy, the air, the ground, his own movement, and immediately vent it through his entire body, not as a destructive blast, but as an enhancement, a self-contained kinetic feedback loop. It would coat his body in an aura of raw power, granting him superhuman speed and strength. It would require immense concentration. A perfect, delicate balance of intake and output. One mistake, one moment of absorbing more than he released, and his body would break. He stared at the page, at the frantic scrawls and diagrams. He circled the final concept, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilarating hope. He gave it a name that signified it was about his whole self, not just one part. A name that promised a new way of being, full calling, far from the blazing sun of the Nevada desert, in a place where the light was sterile and the air tasted of ozone and cold ambition. A man watched. He was not a man of flesh and blood in the conventional sense, but a monument to self-perfection, sculpted from stolen genes and amoral science. His skin was the color of bleached bone, his eyes a piercing, predatory red, and on his forehead, a single, blood-red diamond was embedded, a mark of both his allegiance and his utter sovereignty. Nathaniel Essex, who called himself Mr. Sinister, stood before a vast, floor-to-ceiling chromosomal display. Kaleidoscopic helices of DNA spun in the holographic light, each one a testament to a life's potential, a potential he considered his divine right to catalog, manipulate, and exploit. He was a geneticist in the same way a black hole is a physicist. Both operated on a scale that warped the very fabric of their chosen field. For a decade, one sequence had eluded him. It was a ghost in his database, a tantalizing whisper of ultimate potential. The Muzitifus singularity. He had been the first to detect it, years before its catastrophic manifestation. A dormant, almost non-existent X gene buried deep within the junk DNA of a boy diagnosed as a baseline human. But Sinister's instruments saw deeper. He saw the impossible coding, the latent Omega protocol that promised not just power over a fundamental force, but absolute dominion. He had arranged the test. A simple push. A runaway truck, its brakes remotely disabled. A scenario engineered to force a fight-or-flight response, to trigger the deep-seated survival instincts that so often kick-started a latent mutation. He had expected a flare, a localized event, something he could contain, study, and harvest. He had gotten a god. The resulting catastrophe was a failure and a spectacular success. He had lost the subject, who he presumed was atomized at the epicenter, but the data was exquisite. The energy readings, the seismic reports, the sheer scale of the event, it was the single most significant data point in the history of mutant genetics. It was the benchmark against which all other Omega-level mutants were now measured. The boy, Izukumidaria, had become his private, holy grail. And now, after 10 years of silence, the ghost was not only walking, it had been collected by Charles Xavier. "Prognosis, please," Sinister said to the empty air. The chrome walls of his laboratory seemed to shiver in response. A synthesized, female voice, devoid of all emotion, replied. "Subject Deku has been successfully relocated to the Xavier Institute. Current energy signature is remarkably stable. His null kinetic field has been consciously dissipated. He is in the primary stages of active training under the supervision of the mutant known as Wolverine." Sinister allowed himself a thin, bloodless smile. "Xavier. So predictable. He'll try to heal the boy. To teach him compassion. He sees a broken soul to be mended. I see a perfect weapon that simply requires calibration." He turned away from the DNA display and gestured towards a series of stasis pods that lined the far wall. "The purifiers served their purpose, flushing the target from its nest, but their crude faith is no match for Xavier's sentimentality. It is time for a more direct approach. It is time for a hunt." He ran a pale, long-fingered hand over the cool glass of one of the pods. Inside, suspended in nutrient-rich gel, was a hulking man with a cruel face and a shock of black hair. "The marauders are restless," Sinister mused. "Scalv Hunter desires a worthy target. Arclight craves something to break. And Vertigo, she so enjoys turning a person's own world against them. They will provide an excellent diagnostic." His red eyes gleamed with cold fire. My last test was to see if the weapon could be activated. This test is to see if it can be aimed. Awaken them. Send them to Westchester. Their instructions are simple. Do not capture the boy. Not yet. Test him. Push him. Hurt what he seeks to protect. I want to see what happens when the dam cracks a second time. The grounds of the Jean Grey School had begun to feel less like a prison and more like a paradox to Izuku. He had returned from the desert a week ago, his mind buzzing with theories and a terrifying, fragile seedling of hope. He had his notebooks, his concepts of smashes and flicks, and the grand, unifying theory of full cowling. But theory and practice were two different worlds. He spent most of his days in the newly repaired, and significantly reinforced, danger room. It was no longer a combat simulator for him. It was a laboratory, a padded, perfectly safe, empty room where he could practice simply being. He would stand in the center for hours, eyes closed, focusing on his breathing, on the meditative stillness Logan had taught him. He would let the ambient kinetic energy of the mansion flow around him, a constant stream he learned to ignore. Then, he would try to tap it. Just a little. He'd extend a hand and try to draw in the kinetic energy from the air in front of him, creating a small pocket of vacuum that would make a soft pop as the surrounding air rushed in to fill it. Most of the time, he'd absorb too much, a jolt of power like a static shock running up his arm, and he'd have to spend the next hour calming the growing bonfire in his chest. It was frustrating, painstaking work. It was like learning to walk again after a decade of being bedridden. His muscles, his very instincts, were all wrong. He still kept his distance from the other students. He'd see them in the hallways, laughing, training, living. A part of him, the lonely boy who had eaten alone for 10 years, yearned to join them, but the fear was still too great. He was a faulty engine, prone to backfiring. He couldn't risk being near anyone when it happened. He was in the library, a vast, 2-story chamber filled with the comforting smell of old paper and leather, sequestered in a remote alcove. He was supposed to be studying physics texts Hank had recommended, but his mind was on his own notebooks. He was trying to solve the core problem of full cowling, the feedback loop. How could he vent the energy as quickly as he absorbed it without simply exploding? He was so engrossed in his equations that he didn't notice her at first. "You're the new kid, right? The one who blew a hole in the danger room?" Izuku jumped, his head snapping up so fast he felt a familiar, dangerous pull in his core. He clamped down on it instantly, his heart hammering in his chest. A girl was standing there, leaning against the bookshelf with a casual air of confidence. She had vibrant magenta hair, dark, expressive eyes, and was wearing a yellow and black X-Men training uniform. He recognized her from the student body. Jubilation Lee. Jubilee. Izuku stammered, instinctively trying to cover his notebook. She grinned, a flash of genuine, mischievous fun. "Relax, notebook. Not gonna bite. Just curious. We've all got our oops moments. My first week here, I accidentally set off the sprinkler system in the professor's office with a stray plasmid. He was not pleased." She shuddered theatrically. Izuku blinked. He'd never had a conversation like this before. A normal, casual conversation with someone his own age who wasn't terrified of him. "You, create fireworks?" he asked, his analytical mind kicking in despite his social anxiety. He remembered seeing her file in his studies. Her power was officially designated as pyrokinesis. "PSH, fireworks." She scoffed, but she was smiling. "They're plasmids. Matter energy conversion. Basically, yeah, I make pretty things go boom. What about you?" "The official story is super vague. Something about kinetics? It's complicated," Izuku mumbled, looking down at his desk. "I absorb and release kinetic energy." "Cool," she said, completely unfazed. "So you're like a battery? Can you charge my phone?" The joke was so unexpected, so mundane, that Izuku let out a small, surprised laugh. It was a rusty, unused sound, but it was real. For a second, he wasn't the Deku singularity. He was just a nerdy kid talking to a girl in a library. It was in that moment of fragile, newfound normalcy that the world went sideways. A faint, almost subsonic hum vibrated through the floorboards of the library. It wasn't a quake. It was a steady, rhythmic pulse. Izuku felt it instantly, a dissonant chord in the symphony of motion he was constantly monitoring. Jubilee frowned. Whoa! You feel that? Feels like a big truck idling just outside, but it wasn't a truck. The library's massive, leaded glass windows suddenly bulged inward, the glass groaning under an immense, invisible pressure. Books began to rattle on their shelves. Then, with a deafening crash, the windows exploded inward, showering the room in a crystalline rain of shattered glass. Through the empty frames, they could see the source. A woman stood on the lawn, her fist planted firmly on the ground. She wore a militaristic costume and a metal headband, and with every pulse of the strange energy emanating from her, the very earth shook. This was Arclight, and she was sending seismic waves directly at the mansion's foundation. Alarms began to shriek throughout the school, a shrill, piercing cry for battle stations. What the hell? Jubilee yelled, instinctively throwing up her hands as a shower of glass rained down. A cascade of bright pink and yellow plasmids erupted from her fingertips, incinerating the fallen shards before they could hit her. Izuku was frozen. Not by his power, but by sheer, unadulterated terror. The sudden violence, the destruction, the sound of the screaming alarms, it was a sensory echo of the catastrophe. The bonfire in his chest, so carefully banked and controlled, roared to life. He could feel the vibrations from Arclight's attack pouring into the ground, a buffet of raw energy that his power desperately wanted to devour. His first instinct was to run. To hide. To find his room in the sub-basement, and wrap himself in his null field until the danger was over. That was the safe thing to do. That was what the monster did. But then he looked at Jubilee. She wasn't running. She was standing her ground, her hands crackling with energy, her face set in a defiant scowl as she stared out the broken window at the attacker. She was scared, he could see it in the slight tremor of her hands, but she wasn't backing down. She was a student. And her home was under attack. She was getting ready to fight. The choice Logan had been trying to teach him in the desert, the choice between being a predator and being prey, crystallized in that moment. Hiding was what he had done for 10 years. Hiding was what kept him a prisoner. Get to the lower levels! Find a secure room! Cyclops' voice boomed over the intercom, a calm, commanding presence in the chaos. X-Men, engage! This is not a drill! Jubilee turned to him, her fun-loving demeanor gone, replaced by the grim focus of a trained combatant. Come on, notebook! We gotta move! But Izuku's feet were rooted to the spot. He was watching the battle unfold on the lawn. He saw Cyclops, a blur of blue and yellow, firing precise optic blasts at Arclight, who shielded herself with waves of seismic force. He saw Colossus, his body transformed into gleaming organic steel, charge forward, only to be stopped in his tracks by another figure, a hulking man with an arsenal of futuristic guns. Scalphunter opened fire, not with bullets, but with multiphasic energy beams that forced Colossus to a halt, the impacts gouging molten craters in his armored skin. And then Izuku saw Storm. She descended from the sky like a goddess of vengeance, her eyes white with power, her hands crackling with lightning. A miniature, localized tornado swirled around her, deflecting Scalphunter's blasts. She was magnificent. Terrifying. A hero. He watched as she prepared to unleash the full fury of the heavens on the intruders. But a third figure, a woman in a green and purple costume, seemed to appear from nowhere. Vertigo. She simply gestured towards Storm, and a wave of invisible energy washed over the Weather Witch. Storm cried out, her concentration shattering. The tornado dissipated. The lightning in her hands fizzled out. She stumbled in midair, clutching her head, her face a mask of confusion and nausea. Vertigo's power was attacking her equilibrium, her very sense of up and down. She was helpless, a sitting duck. Arclight saw the opening. She turned from Cyclops and slammed her fists together, aiming a concentrated seismic blast not at the ground, but directly at the disoriented, airborne Storm. It was a kill shot, a concussive wave of pure kinetic force, powerful enough to shatter steel. Time slowed down. Izuku saw it all happen in perfect, horrifying clarity. He saw the wave of force leaving Arclight's hands. He saw Storm, vulnerable and unable to defend herself. He saw Cyclops and Colossus, too far away, too engaged to intercept. There was no time for analysis. No time for equations or theories. There was only the raw, undeniable certainty that if he did nothing, a hero was going to die right in front of him. The person who had draped a blanket over his shoulders. The woman who had treated him with kindness, not fear. The dream he'd had since he was a child, the dream of being a hero, of saving people with a smile, erupted through a decade of fear and self-loathing. He moved. He didn't run towards the fight. He ran towards the victim. Jubilee yelled his name, but he didn't hear her. The world narrowed to a single path between him and Storm. He burst out of the broken library window, his bare feet hitting the grass of the lawn. The seismic vibrations in the ground were a torrent of power, and this time, he didn't fight it. He let it in. The bonfire in his chest became a raging star. The pain was excruciating, but he fed on it. He absorbed the motion of his own pumping legs, the rush of the wind past his ears, the sound of the battle. He was a comet of green and gray, a blur of motion that no one had anticipated. He reached Storm just as Arclight's seismic blast was about to hit her. He didn't try to counter it. He didn't try to deflect it. He did the only thing he knew how to do. He became a shield. He planted his feet, threw his arms wide, and put himself directly in the path of the attack. The seismic wave hit him like a physical fist. It was a solid wall of kinetic energy, and the void inside him opened wide and drank it down. The force of it should have torn him apart, should have launched him across the state. Instead, it just vanished. Into him. The power surge was blinding. His vision went white. The star in his chest pulsed, threatening to go supernova. He felt his bones creak and his muscles tear under the strain of containing such a violent, instantaneous influx of power. He let out a strangled cry of agony, his knees buckling. But he held on. He gritted his teeth, focused on Logan's voice in his memory, control through stillness, and he forced the dam to hold. Just barely. The world came back into focus. He was on one knee, panting, his body screaming in protest. The grass in a perfect circle around him had been turned to dust by the sheer energy he was radiating. Storm had fallen to the ground behind him, dazed but unharmed. Silence fell over the battlefield. The Marauders, Arclight, Scalphunter, and Vertigo, stared at him, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. The X-Men stared at him with the same expressions. What was that? Arclight stammered, looking at her fists as if they had betrayed her. Where did my blast go? Scalphunter adjusted the optic on his rifle, trying to get a reading on Izuku. Energy signature is off the charts. He's a capacitor. He just ate it. Izuku pushed himself to his feet, his body trembling. He was overflowing with power, a vessel filled to the brim and threatening to crack. He couldn't hold it for long. But he couldn't release it either. A single flick of his finger right now could level the entire estate. So he just stood there, a silent, trembling shield between the villains and his newfound friends. He couldn't fight back. Not yet. But he could defend. He could stand in the way. He could take the hits. For 10 years, his power had only brought destruction. For the first time, he was using it to protect. A slow, fierce smile spread across Scalphunter's face. It was a predator's smile. Well. Sinister didn't tell us the weapon could play defense. Let's see how much it can take before it pops. He raised his rifle and opened fire. Arclight grinned and began pounding the ground again. Vertigo sent another wave of her disorienting power forward. They directed all their attacks at him. Beams of energy, waves of seismic force, pulses of nauseating power. And Izuku just stood there and took it all. He absorbed every shot. Every vibration. Every wave. The energy poured into him, a relentless, agonizing flood. He was a lightning rod in the heart of a perfect storm. The pain was unbelievable, but beneath it, a new feeling was being forged in the crucible of the attack, resolve. The X-Men, freed from the onslaught, regrouped. What is he doing? Scott yelled, his optic blasts now providing cover fire. He's protecting us, Storm said, shaking her head to clear the last of Vertigo's effects. He has become a perfect shield. It was true. The Marauders couldn't get a single shot through to the X-Men. Every attack was simply swallowed by the silent, green-haired boy who stood unmoving in the center of the storm. Frustration mounted on the Marauders' faces. Their mission was to test the boy, but they couldn't even make him flinch. He was an immovable object, an absolute defense. "This is pointless," Arclight growled, her arms beginning to ache. "We can't get through him." "Agreed," Scalphunter grunted. "The Master has his data." He fired one last volley to cover their retreat. "Let's go. Our work here is done." As quickly as they had arrived, they vanished, retreating into the cover of the woods surrounding the estate. The moment the attack stopped, Izuku collapsed. The star in his chest, no longer being fed, stabilized from its critical state, but the sheer amount of energy he had absorbed was still a crushing weight. He lay on the grass, twitching, his body unable to process the overload. The X-Men rushed to his side. "Izuku! Are you alright?" Storm knelt beside him, her hand hovering over his shoulder, afraid to touch him. He couldn't speak. He could only gasp for air. He had done it. He had protected them. He hadn't lost control. Logan was the last one to arrive, loping back from his pursuit of the retreating Marauders. He knelt down and looked at Izuku, not with pity, but with a new, profound respect. He saw the agony on the boy's face, but he also saw the iron will beneath it. He placed a hand on Izuku's shoulder. It was a firm, grounding touch. "You did good, kid," Wolverine growled, his voice softer than Izuku had ever heard it. "You did real good." In the distance, from his hidden laboratory, Mr. Sinister watched the scene on his monitors. His thin smile was wider now. The data streams were pouring in, charting the boy's energy absorption, his pain tolerance, his psychological response. "Remarkable," he breathed, his red eyes glowing. "He possesses not only infinite capacity, but a martyr's resolve. He's not just a weapon. He's a shield. A protector." He steepled his fingers, a new, more brilliant plan forming in his cold, calculating mind. "Xavier thinks he's found a hero. He has no idea. He's just tempering the steel for me." He had the data he needed. He now knew the boy's potential was even greater than he had ever imagined, and more importantly, he had discovered his weakness. It wasn't a physical limitation. It was his heart.